Hi, and welcome to Ward 13. My guest is Jim O'Connell.
Hi, John. How are you? Good evening.
I am fine. And you had a question for me before the show about...
Yeah, about your screenshot here of War 13 screen celebrates the Falcons. I didn't understand quite what was going on there. I recognize Mayor Craig,
right.
But...
Those are the peregrine falcon chicks that they have the band put on them.
I see.
And I didn't know who the other people were, so it was easier to take them out by putting Horus on the left and the Eye of Wadjet, also known as the Eye of Horus.
I see. So there were people standing on each side of her.
Right.
And this was the chicks that were born in Manchester at the top secret site of the Falcons' nest.
Yeah, and they have the camera.
Nest. Yes.
And I'm totally into birds, except I was telling Jim I'm colorblind. So that really, because different birds and different sexes have different plumage.
Right.
But a falcon...
So is there four? Is it looks like there's four of them there.
4 chicks.
Wow.
One of the chicks on the left is looking up at Horus. But of course, Montu was before Horus. He was the war god of Egypt. And then it becomes Horus. Because the falcon in hieroglyphics, it's HR.
Oh, right.
The sound. I had a friend that was totally into hieroglyphics and the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And in San Jose, I think it was the Rosicrucians had a temple, and they had created like the inside of, it could have been Tut's tomb or somebody's tomb, with all the hieroglyphics. So he studied it, and I bought a book and looked into it. I found it pretty interesting, but my focus was totally into the birds.
Well, I guess if you were,
because God in a desert. Horus and the falcon is he who is most high and looking down on you.
Right.
And so the perfect thing for a god.
Yeah, I remember there was a little joke about the kids in the Egyptian class, and they had a slate and a chisel and a hammer, and they're taking dictation,
Right.
And the teacher says, the powerful lion walked through the jungle, and the kid starts chipping away, and he says, "Is powerful spelled with one testicle or two?"
But it is like that. But eventually it became the Psalms, and it became like a phonetic language. Right. But they were all. Nobody really knows hieroglyphics.
Right.
People have been studying them ever since Napoleon's time when
Napoleon was the big archaeology guy, right? I mean,
and the guy they found the stone.
Yeah, right. Napoleon's famous for a lot of things, but what many people don't realize is sort of the early excavations in Egypt and other places. Was Napoleon was a big advocate of that, and a lot of it dates from the Napoleonic period.
Napoleon was such a fascinating person. Not only was he one of the greatest generals ever, on par with Alexander the Great, but he was an intellectual too. And I know you're Irish, the British, he was their great devil,
the great nemesis,
and they thought of him as like we would think of Hitler or something.
Right.
But
I mean, that's why we've Trafalgar Square with Wellington on the top of it. There's
and
the
you
Battle
had
of Trafalgar
in Dublin.
Yeah,
he didn't last after 1966.
I remember Nelson's column was blown up in 1966 in Dublin. But where I grew up in Ireland, right in the port of Cork, the whole port, the fortifications there. It's the second largest natural harbour in the world. It was a major, it's huge, and so there are lots of Napoleonic fortifications there. But
because they feared the invasion.
They feared that the French Navy would attack Ireland and
an amphibious attack too.
And yes, of course, and then of course be closer to Britain to be able to launch attacks. But there are things called Martello Towers, and they created these Martello Towers, and
just like the one that it figures in Ulysses.
Ulysses, yeah.
Oh, I've seen it.
Yeah, so the Martello Towers are round.
That's what they were for.
Round towers. They were signaling towers. So you had defenses. They weren't defensive towers. They looked like defensive things, but they're circular. They look like very much like a gas tank one would see, like a big Texaco gas tank at an airport or something.
They had fires up there.
Well, they had semaphore for the day and then flame at nighttime. But the idea was in Cork Harbour, for instance, it was 8 or 9 miles in a straight line from the harbour mouth to the city where the garrison was. So if the French fleet was spotted off the coast and there were forts right at the headland, if they became came under attack, then the signals. When you look, if you look at plotted out the sites of the Martello Towers up through the river, you see, even though they might be on different sides of the river as it twists and meanders around, the roof of one is within line of sight of the next one.
Right.
So they could send messages, as quick as they could in those days up to the garrison to alert the city that the French were landing. So
yeah, before the telegraph, like in Civil War battles.
And in Ireland, they would have used the heliograph, but since the sun didn't shine that often, it wouldn't have worked about half the time.
What's a heliograph?
Like you'll see in the old cowboy movies, the mirrors, when you do the sun.
Okay.
You see the old westerns, and you have the cavalry sort of flashing across the valleys. You either have some Native American with a blanket doing smoke signals, and you have the cavalry with their heliographs flashing back and forth. Flashing the sun. But anyway, that was my tip.
One last thing about Napoleon. I was reading a book about Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt, which is a whole cottage industry. Hannah Arendt being a German Jew who was she was in love with Heidegger, who the great philosophers, but gave his name over to Hitler before Hitler and the Nazis. He didn't even want anything to do with him. A fascinating relationship they had. But one of her early works, when she got her doctorate, was her first professor was Heidegger, where they met, was about a German Jew, if we can use that term.
I'm not sure where we are with that today. Yeah.
After the emancipation of the Jews in Germany. But I never knew it was Napoleon and his ideas that brought that to the continent.
Oh, really?
That he, in the part of I don't know if it's part of the Napoleonic Code or whatever, but when he put, like in the German Confederation, the Confederate or the Confederation of the Rhine, whichever was the one he controlled, that was part of the laws that Jews would be emancipated. So it's amazing how liberal he was on the one hand, but somebody like Beethoven thought of him as a hero. I think Byron did for a while too. But then after Spain and that, he became the tyrant.
Napoleon suffers from the fact that the old adage about the history is written by the victors. And Napoleon,
he lost twice.
Yes, and so twice, and also then there's a double whammy from both the Anglophile side, from the sort of British history side. Obviously, he was a defeated there, but even within France, they were depending on within France,
they were exhausted.
Yeah.
In the 100 Days, people turned on him that he was relying on.
Right. So France went through its own catharsis more than once. On the Napoleon and in an anti-Napoleon way. So really he had a very small constituency that was going to support him and when it comes to science, we talked about architecture, but science and Enlightenment and stuff, he was
he was the defender of the Republic at first, and I think it's the Republic that came up with the meter, but he was very much of that time, the Enlightenment, an Enlightenment figure, but then that brutal fight in Spain, and but
it's, just to be simplistic, I guess the thing that the fact that Napoleon goes into Russia and then Hitler repeats the error 100 years later,
and they restart.
But then again, as Americans, we look at we look at Afghanistan and the Khyber Pass, and the graveyard of nations, etc., or the graveyard of empires. And what do? We go marching in there,
after they defeat the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's kind of anyway. So history does repeat itself, and we do make mistakes.
We'll get into the United States of Europe, which was the Napoleonic idea.
Yeah, that's an interesting. It's been an interesting week there.
But one of the lessons about Russia is nobody understands how big it is. And one of Hitler's generals, they had a globe, a big globe, and they're trying to show, look at the expanse of Russia. But Napoleon, who was a genius, one of the greatest military commanders, and he thought he had allies that would. He was going to punish one of Alexander the First for turning on him, but his vanity got him, and then he had to go into Moscow. He had to sleep in his bed. And all the miscalculations you made.
And it goes back to material. It goes back to materiel and supply chains, and I think he's the one who said an army marches on its stomach.
Yeah.
And so you think he would have learned that,
and Hitler's generals, they always said that he was basically just a corporal from the World War I. He'd never seen anything beyond the front lines, which his courage, as a common soldier, he won the Iron Cross, which they you normally don't do as an enlisted man. But I can't remember, the general said all he could think about his war is people bleeding right in front of the line, and rather than a real general, a real strategic, it's like a fencer. You attack and then you retreat. But you could never. It's amazing.
Yeah.
The war. You could read about the war. That war and many wars, so much.
So many lessons to be. Well, it's a lifetime. Most of us, or many of us. I mean, I've read. I don't claim to be learned and have learned everything there is to know or anything on any one of these wars.
You never know it all.
But no, and the problem is that some think they do, and that's why we call them know-it-alls. But you can spend. It's not that I have spent a lifetime studying, say, World War II or or other wars, but I've read about them constantly. For 40,
that
50
was
years.
The 2 world wars were the great
and I still learn, there's still
events.
New sort of strategic lessons, world power lessons, etc., to be learned constantly.
The lessons of World War I were forgotten in one generation.
In a very
but
short.
People don't realize the EU, Schuman, the French foreign minister, NATO was there to make sure that the United States would be there, and they would be blooded at the same time if the Soviet Union attacked.
Yes, yeah.
And none of this waiting 3 or 2 years.
Right.
And the European Union is a response to those horrific wars, and the nationalism. The pettiness of, when you read about it, I was just reading about the BEF in 1940. The pettiness.
The British Expeditionary Force.
The pettiness of the general staff and their hatred of the French. In 1940. Their refusal to cooperate with the French.
Right.
And it's just amazing.
It is.
How they make a defeat into a.
Well, we have, there are major changes for anybody who's not paying attention to, if you're a political scientist, this is a great time to be alive. There are changes happening. We can see them here in the United States. We're not going to that tonight, but. We see it happening more writ large. We have
the failure of the European Union would remap history.
Right. Well, it would remap history, and the question is, the growth of nationalism. We're seeing it in Brazil, we've seen it in Philippines, we've seen it, in other places. So
Hungary,
it's yes. Well, within the EU, Hungary and Poland. Yeah. But so it was interesting for those who may not know. The European Union had its European parliamentary elections on this weekend, and
they weren't pretty to the 2 big parties.
In Britain, they weren't. The 2 big parties in Britain actually in the EU as well, right? But within Britain, first of all, you have the 2 biggest parties there were the Conservative Party and Labour Party, and we had the British Prime Minister effectively announced her resigning. She's still in office and is actually in Europe tonight at a meeting.
Until they pick the leader of the party who becomes PM.
Which is going to be this navel-gazing exercise that's going to go on for the next 2 months.
You don't think Boris Johnson will be it?
The question for Boris Johnson, now we're getting into the arcane nature of the way in which the Conservative Party chooses its leader.
It's a greasy poll.
Well, what happens there is that, he has the parliamentary party will choose from a slate of candidates. Currently there are 10 as of right now. The final 2 will be passed down to the membership, the party members, so across the various counties, etc., constituencies.
Is that the way they handled it in the past?
This was a new method that was brought in the last 10 years.
Because Thatcher lost it at a conference.
So after all of that, they changed it to this method. So they're now chosen by the members, but the parliamentary party chooses from amongst whoever.
Chooses the 2. Okay.
So right now there are 10 candidates. That's going to be whittled down to 2, and eventually those 2 candidates will be placed in front of the about 100,000 members, active members of the Conservative Party in Britain.
Both will be pro Brexit.
Well, they could be anything, but it's likely they'll be. It's likely. Well, first of all, we're trying to read tea leaves, but it would seem that I'm sorry if we lose people here, but it would seem that there'll be people who will be pro coming out of Europe without any agreement, just a hard dropout, and then somebody who will be supporting of either the current deal proposed by May or a similar deal, and one of those will be chosen. The challenge for Johnson will be if he makes it through the parliamentary party and gets to the final 2, then he's a shoe-in, because the membership.
Oh, he's popular because he was elected mayor of London.
The problem with the membership, though, is that the membership is, they're people looking for the red meat. So it's kind of the opposite to, say, presidential elections here, where a presidential candidate here has to make it through the red meat part, the sort of the people who want to drive you to one side, in a Republican they want them far right, the Democrat would like the guy far left, but he has to be popular, or she has to be populated by the general populace.
Right, you have to be elected by...
You have to be elected. In the choice in Britain of choosing just the leader of the party, who in this case will end up being the Prime Minister, of course, for at least temporarily, is that it's the opposite of that. You have to get through the parliamentary party, which is more pragmatic. Right. But the members, the 100,000 members, are like, we just want out of Europe, and they're very unrealistic, so they'll go for Johnson. And then, somebody described it, if they end up doing a hard Brexit, it would be this greatest example of, self-inflicted wound in history of any nation.
Right. I just keep looking at it, and it just seems like nobody really wants it, because people know it's going to have economic, except for the hard liners 40% of people existed. I've been in Britain as late as the year 2000, and I think Edward Heath died, and there's people were still just common people bitching that he's the one that got us in the European Union.
Well, there's a dangerous.
This was like 26
This is
years
this
later.
combination of jingoism and nationalism and full security threat kind of idea. The idea of those things, driving policy, and so the Conservatives have been playing fast and loose with this for 40 years.
Yeah,
this idea
since Heath.
Yeah, trying to make an enemy of Europe, and they're out to get us.
Thatcher was very much anti-Europe.
But Thatcher was pragmatic.
That was her public face, and she would have her ministers that would attack. They were never that prominent.
She was going to go over. What she was doing was, Thatcher was over in Europe wielding a big stick. Demanding deals that were often unreasonable in terms of how much they were going to contribute, etc.
Right, and to get what she wanted.
And the dynamic in Europe is much like it is in the United States, with you've got states like California and New York and others who are net contributors to the federal funds, and then you have, it just happens to be that many of the red states in the south are net receivers.
Yeah, and Britain was seen as the bulwark against France and Germany, who were the driving force behind so much, the Treaty of Maastricht, the Euro.
Right, and and Britain was like recalcitrant, and
they would not go with the Euro. Britain, they didn't want to. They thought it was going to be disadvantageous to the city, to the London financial market. But they merged with Frankfurt. But are they still merged, London and Frankfurt?
The two exchanges.
They broke apart.
Yeah, I don't know if they've. So they're not. They're still independent, but they have a connection.
Really worked out. But they still have agreements.
It's not like and I don't understand it well enough to address it fully. Other than it's not like there's now one market rather than the DAX and the FTSE.
There's London the city was the big market after New York, but Frankfurt always was a wannabe to hit above its weight.
So Britain's in a pretty sorry state after the elections this weekend. We had this guy Nigel Farage.
He's back.
He is back. He's been a member of the European Parliament since the last time. But he started his party. Now he was originally with UKIP, which is the
Independence Party.
But effectively,
this
is but it's effective. That's because they allowed their colours to be seen, because UKIP had all the sort of anti-immigrant stuff. There's lots of ugliness there.
Right.
People.
It was kind of like a National Front in a way.
Yeah. So like white nationalists.
Too much of that.
Yeah, and so they were sort of standing up for Britain first, etc. But those were code words for
Oz. What was his name? The fascists or Mosley.
Mosley, yeah. Mosley,
Nicholas Mosley's father.
Yeah. So
he was a novelist.
So one of the narratives that's been afoot in the last week is that this party, the Brexit party, is only 6 weeks old, and they managed to capture 28 seats out of 75. The truth of the matter is that it's really a rebranding of UKIP,
right?
Because Nigel Farage deserves some credit for having created this party and winning, being the largest winners in the elections in a period of 6 weeks. But it's not as though he arrived new,
right? Let's remind people that Nigel Farage was related to Cambridge Analytica, that at the time of the finagling with the U.S. election by Cambridge Analytica, for people we won't talk about, they had the same clientele. Farage has met Trump, and he used to go see
And some of his
Julian Assange right at the embassy.
And if you go to, and I'm a guy with an accent, but if you go and you watch Fox News or Fox News TV, and you listen to some of the guys, some of them have been removed now. One of them in particular has been out of there.
Behind him? But is Murdoch out?
I don't know where Murdoch is now. The Murdoch family
and family, right?
But the people who are on TV live, there are some people with English accents on there who are often opining on American politics, etc. And there's a connection with them. It's all there's a certain the same ilk. But anyway, so you end up with these people who want Britain to crash out of the EU, and they managed to get not the majority of seats. They're the largest single group who won last week. But this weekend. What's very interesting is that the Conservative Party, who are the governing party in Britain today, they only got 9% of the votes in the European elections, which is incredible for the ruling party. That would be the equivalent here of the Democrats or the Republicans having an election and only getting 9%. And then the Labour Party ended up with 14%.
How does that harbinger for national elections?
It's difficult to say because for those who so we're talking about European elections. There's a European Parliament.
Because we no longer have the where you can call a snap election unless you have 2/3 of Parliament.
Right. So they used to be able to call it snap election in Britain anytime
to take
they want.
advantage of
something
something good that happened.
Right. Now they're more constrained, but it's not like here where there's a presidential election every 4 years, a congressional election every 2 years. Senators sit for 6 years.
It has to be within,
but it's within certain periods of many months or more than a year. So
that gives them the ruling government, the party that's the government,
unless the Parliament overrides and has a plurality, or at least not a plurality, it has a supermajority that says yes, we can do it.
But how is it translated in the past, the European elections? Is it a harbinger of a party strength?
No, it's not. It's not because we saw in the previous time around UKIP ran, and the reason why Britain one of the reasons
Labour always did well. In European elections.
They did, but UKIP ran the last time and ended up getting quite a few seats.
Right,
Nigel Farage was one of them.
They were miserable.
As a response to that, this is why David Cameron ended up, to hold the line, so to speak, to agree to a referendum, which is what brought us to Brexit. But UKIP was ended up with either no seats or 1 seat in the parliamentary elections, which followed a year later or 2 years later. So there's not a direct. The fact that the Conservatives got 9% in the vote this past weekend, well, the voting was on Thursday in Britain. But they didn't count the votes until Sunday because in other countries in Europe, remember you've got 27 countries in Europe and they have different electoral rules and systems. So actually voting was going on different days in Europe, the last of which finished on Sunday. So it was on Sunday night, Sunday evening, it was the last of the European countries to vote, and then they began counting votes. So the voting happened on Thursday. The actual counting didn't start until Sunday night. Just a little sidebar here, which I thought was commendable and interesting, and a thought for the United States, is that the BBC, for instance, British Broadcasting Company, and others, the media in Britain is precluded by law from talking about the election during the day of the election, and I think actually the day before as well. Certainly the day of and the day before.
Yeah, now France has a law like that.
They can say, you can say, for instance, there's voting on today, starts at 6 a.m., whatever it is.
But nothing that could tip an election.
No interviews, no opinions,
polling.
No polling. There is a blackout period across all media. At least television and radio, which I found interesting because if you listen to, I listen to BBC World Service, I listen to Radio Deutsche Welle. I don't sit all night listening to all of them, but I touch off each of them to kind of get. I like to see what the Canadian News Broadcasting Company has to say, and and the US ones of course as well. Especially in today's environment where you're sort of what's the truth, etc. But it was interesting that there was all this noise about the European elections and Brexit and all that stuff, and all of a sudden, whiteout. There was nothing, and I think it was 2 days. I think it was the day before, and it's always struck me, and I know we're going off this topic now, but it's always struck me as problematic in the U.S. when we have elections, and if you live, west of the Rockies, effectively the elections are being called.
Yeah, Carter conceded in 1980 before the West Coast ceased voting, and Tip O'Neill told Hamilton Jordan, "Well, that's you, expletive deleted us again."
Right. Yeah.
And because he had no. whatever Jimmy Carter's virtues, practical politics in Washington wasn't one of them.
Right.
You don't do that. When Frank Church is still trying to hang on to his seat, and
Right.
you have California had a very vigorous Republican Party in 1980. It doesn't anymore, but
that could change. This is what, like, these things can change. None of them are set in stone, and there's always, I think,
Americans are strange too, because sometimes I even know people they're going to go with the front runner, but that's every country,
right.
probably.
I think one of the things is that what Britain is learning today is that the things that served it well for most of its recent parliamentary history, I mean a century, etc.
The stability of Parliament.
That was never, even though
first past the post.
Yeah, it was inconceivable that would have deteriorated and fallen apart. It's falling apart in our presence right now.
Yeah, it is kind of a shock, isn't it?
It's a shock. You could have picked. Think of the lunacy of Italy, for instance. 5,000 governments in 3 weeks. Kind of
France.
Thing. Or France too.
When they were talking about getting rid of the Electoral College and the bill, which was written by Birch Bayh, who wrote 3 other constitutional amendments, got 3/4 of the vote of the House, but got bottled up in the Senate in 69-70. They would talk about France because the constant. They had 5 republics, but after the war, you had the fall of the 4th republic, and that was virtually a military coup that brought General de Gaulle.
So you would have looked at it.
But all the governments, because they have that hybrid system, this instability because they are proportional representation. They've got all.
You would have looked at Britain and said, "Well, Britain is like the Rock of Gibraltar. That's never going to fall.
There.
Yeah, it's stable
because of the stability."
And now we look at I think we're foreshadowing what's happening today. There's a straight line between what's happening today and the dissolution of the British Union. I mean, it's easy to see.
How did I know the Welsh Party did very well?
Plaid Cymru.
How did
the Scottish National Party did really well. So interestingly, in Scotland, which was an important base of Labour votes, Labour came in 5th. So there were a couple. The Scottish Nationalist Party came in.
Labour used to be very big until the Scottish National Party and that referendum. But and for people that are watching, there is the party in Northern Ireland that holds the balance of power.
Well, what's interesting in Northern Ireland was that for the first time ever, the Ulster Union. Well, there was a change in Northern Ireland, which
tormented Anglo-Irish history
forever,
200 years.
And you see this. You see this again and again.
Parnell.
One of the worst possible scenarios in any organization or on a committee.
Yeah.
We've seen it on committees. You see it in organizations. You see it in world politics.
When
you have 2 almost equal bodies, of 45 to 50, 49% each, or those kind of numbers, and you've got a group of 3% that holds the balance of power. I mean, this has happened. We've seen this.
Israel always is before. The Likud always has to have these extremist parties.
Well, we've seen it fall to dysfunction. We see this, and not to get off into other tangents, we've seen this in countries like Zambia or in Uganda, where it's sort of tribal in its politics, and so what happens is no one group is ever going to be the majority, and because there's not 20 groups, which would be fine, it would be 11 against 9, but invariably it's 2 against the other one. So you end up with 66% against 33%, which is always unequal. So the 33% side always feels and is hard done by.
Well, they have a veto in a way because they can bring down the government.
Well, the middle ones do. So in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland in British politics for years has been this. You talk about what was Stormont, but theirs was a change. They had a change. They have 3. Britain has got 75 members of the European Parliament, MEPs they're called, members of the European Parliament, who sit in what is the European Parliament. 3 of those seats are from Northern Ireland, representing Northern Ireland. And up until yesterday, or this weekend, until Sunday, I'm wrong, it was actually Monday, because they started their count late and were late announcing it yesterday morning. Those 3 seats were divided between 2 unionist seats, but 2 different parties, the DUP and the Ulster Unionist Party, and first of all, it was SDLP with what's his name, John Hume, but as soon as he left, it was Sinn Féin. So it's been a nationalist and 2 unionists. Well, what happened on yesterday was the division of power there. The Alliance Party, which is the non-sectarian party that occupies that middle ground, they won the 3rd seat.
No kidding.
So there's only one. So the unions have gone from 66% of the representation in the European Parliament in Northern Ireland to 33% for the first time in 40 years. No. No. So they took a drubbing. Northern Ireland ended up, as a result of this, they supported candidates who were pro-remaining in Europe.
So it's almost like an establishment on both sides. Even like Labour took a drubbing too. Not as bad as Tories.
Not as bad as the Tories. The two major parties, mostly if you looked at British politics since the turn of the last century, you had Labour Party and you had the Conservative Party, and
the Social Democrats, but they destroyed themselves.
But the Social Democrats would never get above 15%.
And going into that coalition with the Tories,
that was a disaster. So they were down, but they did really well. So the idea that the two biggest parties in the last 100 years in Britain, between them, got 9 and 14, all matched 23% of the votes in this last election is just amazing. So now it looks like Brexit there's likely to be a referendum. I think is the most likely outcome.
Yeah, Corbyn wants that second referendum.
Well, he doesn't, but he's been forced to one. That's the problem.
Oh, so that's because he's
been forced
something in the
guard. Corbyn, the problem with Corbyn.
Right, he just wanted the.
Corbyn has been invariably, he has grown up to be sort of suspicious of Europeans and European elites and
one of those
all that
CND.
Stuff. Yeah. So
campaign against nuclear.
Those were the days.
They certainly were.
He has always been suspicious of them. So in his nature, he's been a bit of, he hasn't come out and been a Brexiteer, but he's suspicious of Europe. But he's been forced to the second referendum. The problem with the second referendum, which is the most likely outcome, two very likely outcomes. October this year, there'll either be, I think it's October 13th, there will be a hard leaving of the EU by Britain, which would be catastrophic.
It was
not just for Britain,
but for the EU,
but for the EU as well. So if you've
got the world,
if you've got European shares, you got companies doing business there, etc. Be very
because
careful.
The old ties between the US and the UK that existed up to 74,
right?
You just can't recreate it overnight. Although our illustrious president, who doesn't seem to realize that Japan was part of belligerent World War II, thinks that they can be, which is a pipe dream.
I don't know where to.
It's crazy.
I don't know where to start.
All
with
the trade that go, the continent.
So Britain is attempting, to start
with the
conversations with the United States around an independent trade, because right now the trade is between Europe, including Britain, and the United States. There is no trade agreement.
But unilateral trade agreements are a thing of the past.
Plus they take years to develop anyway. It takes years. So they're talking. But one of the things that I found interesting was as these conversations started, in their very early negotiations, and they're just starting, and they're not really in the public. They're in the public domain, but you have to go find them on page 75 of the New York Times. But a few of us get that far in. But one of the things that jumped off the page to me was United States wants U.S. chicken to be allowed into Britain, because U.S. chicken cannot be sold in Europe today.
Yeah, I know.
And the reason is because it's
chlorinated. And it's chlorinated.
Because we chlorinate all our chicken. Now, I thought I knew a few things. There's another thing I didn't know.
You didn't know about that?
Yeah. So, we just we basically...
They used to fly it in because a military base can have it.
Yes, can have, yeah.
So you get trade.
So we're eating bleached chicken, which is illegal in the 27 countries of the of Europe.
When I first met her, she said, how come the milk lasts so long here? Because she lived in Holland for a while.
Because if you turn off the lights, it glows in the dark.
Because they have put formaldehyde in it.
Yeah,
and she had a lot to learn about.
So one of the things, if you read the British press recently, they talk about chlorinated chicken, and those who are in favour of staying in Europe and not, having an independent, trade and starting with Britain, with the United States and others, is that we don't want to start eating chlorinated chicken.
There's also stuff about GMO products too.
Oh yeah.
So bovine somatropin, BST.
Well, the problem for the people who are nationalists in Britain who say let's just get out of Europe is what they don't understand, of course, is that there's 40 years worth of rules, regulations, and policy which they don't. So we've got an FDA, right? The Federal Drug Administration, and so
which was scaled back progressively since the George H.W. Bush presidency.
But it's still, you still can't get up on the back of a chuck wagon like in some Western movies and offer some rot gut and say it cures rheumatoid arthritis.
I don't know about that anymore.
Well, actually, now you think about it,
we have a new Attorney General. Was it number 3 or number 4?
And actually, if it's what is it, a whole medicine or whatever, like anything you buy in the
supplements,
all the supplements don't fall under the FDA. But anyway, so
you don't have the resources.
It's very hard to extricate yourself from such a. You think about just the rules around. You must have written on toys. Parts small enough to choke somebody under 3 or what. There's a million regulations.
We're importing since Trump, but before the trade war. Chinese made toy stuff have lead paint on them, and stuff like that. And how they were getting in is because I'm going to get rid of 1,000 rules for everyone that's passed.
Yeah,
I can't do a Trump imitation.
Yeah,
I might have a hemorrhage and just drop dead.
Well, the idea, it always
seized by demons. And
It seems strange.
I'll have to ask Montu or Horace to come save me.
I always, people who talk about, regulation. I hear, politicians talk about, we need to get rid of regulations because they're costing businesses something. Like,
who cares about drugs? Let the market determine the purity of drugs. Just like on the street with heroin users.
So we don't need regulation. Why do you need the airbags in a car? And they don't need regulation. The steering wheel must be bigger than 3 inches in diameter. Like there's a reason why regulations are being created. I'm sure that if you go through, pages and pages of regulations, you'll find some that are outdated or overreaching or no longer apply. I'm all for cleaning them up all the time. But this idea that somehow the wonderful business people of any country, let alone the United States, are benevolent and the market will solve the problem, they'll do what is right. They haven't ever done what was right previously, so why would we think they do it now? I love to relate to people if they're interested in the true history of industry and business in the world. This isn't an anti-US business thing. There are many fine businesses and business people in any country, and there certainly are here. But if you look at the history of World War II, and you look at the Truman Commission and Truman's role.
That's how he came to prominence.
Right, when he goes out during, he was kind of lowly thought of under the Roosevelt administration, and so he was the vice president, and he was maybe even put out the pasture.
He wouldn't even become the vice president, but for the Truman Commission. That brought him to national prominence. The incredible fraud.
Right.
But Arthur Miller's first successful play, All My Sons, is shipping the defective parts.
Right. So we learned through the Truman Commission that during World War II, when the finest generation, as we like to call them, I have questions about that. Not that I don't want to honor them in light of especially yesterday and Memorial Day.
Okay, Jim, let's get back.
But this idea that in
wasn't them that shipped out defective torpedoes.
Yeah. So we're shipping steel. We have Pennsylvania businesses shipping steel to Mexico, knowing that it was being sent to Germany to build Panzer tanks. And we have American.
Same with Japan. The rails until they embargoed.
So we have American businesses during World War II shipping steel knowingly out of the country, knowing it was going to the Axis powers, where the sons of men and women and men and women from the United States were going to go and have to fight back. That was going on in World War II. Why
they were conglomerates, Jim. General Motors, where the congressional hearings, which I always figured it was a move to break up General Motors in the 50s, and I always figured part of that was that scandal where General Motors was operating its factories in Germany and the Axis countries through their intermediaries in South America. But it was it was a corporation that has its own life.
This idea that sort of business is going to do, if you actually, because if you have to put your head in the sand and pretend it wasn't so. You either don't know your history, you haven't bothered to study it, or you don't.
Britain was selling war material to the Soviet Union and China during the Korean War when there were British Tommies in Korea. And you know what? Is it Attlee? Because I'm dyslexic.
Yeah, Clem Attlee.
Yeah, he's buried in Westminster Abbey, over in where the part they have for the labor. Way over right in front of the door. You just
the Brits have been notorious.
But he said we
years.
have contracts, so they kept selling material, and there weren't. I don't know how many Tommies were in Korea.
We see this. This isn't just a British or American phenomenon. We go
companies would sell anything to anybody.
If you look at the pedigree or the provenance or the history of the German
Catch-22. That's the thing. Remember Marlowe Mandelbrot? one.
Right.
He takes the contract for the German Luftwaffe and bombs his own thing.
Right.
So it's just
but if you look at the military-industrial complex in the Ruhr Valley of Germany in the 1940s or in 1930s, and the acquisitions in the old Czechoslovakia, etc., and you look at those companies, and whether it's Fokker or Siemens or Philips, or think about the names you see on your equipment and businesses
my
today.
father was a World War II. He bought a Mitsubishi TV. He was talking about the bombers.
Second largest car company in the world is Volkswagen. Right, so and you saw the news tonight. I don't know if you saw the news tonight that GM, which is currently the third biggest car manufacturer in the world, right? No, Fiat Chrysler is in discussions with Renault, the French Renault company, to combine. And that will make them the third biggest. So it'll be if you were asked at a quiz tomorrow, what are the largest car manufacturing companies in the world? Number one is Toyota. Number two is Volkswagen, and if this merger and number three is GM. If this merger goes ahead, it'll be Toyota, Volkswagen, and Fiat Chrysler Renault.
You know what's interesting, since we're off the topic already, was during World War II, German industry never reached the heights that it did in 1917, 1918. People think it was just because the Nazis, or they had this incredible bureaucracy.
Right.
There were all sorts of bureaucrats everywhere. But they never reached their economic potential, so maybe they had to buy from General Motors and U.S. intermediaries. And Britain, under Lloyd George, under that wartime socialism, they quadrupled the British economy. But of course, that war completely exhausted them financially.
And bankrupted. Yeah, I mean, Britain.
But what we all think about free enterprise, or even what we think we know about history, generally isn't so.
Well, we were on here some months ago with Howard
free
Zinn
trade,
and
free trade was considered, the failure of free trade in the 30s was considered one of the harbingers of creating the conditions that made World War II inevitable.
Right. And
free trade was supposed to keep the countries working together.
Right.
And when I was at Boston University and later doing my graduate studies and I was in the Army, Comic-Con was like the British European market.
Right.
And the United States would never allow them to integrate with either the EU or the International System of Payment.
The EEC, the old
EEC, right.
Actually, the British Steel and Coal first, and then the EEC.
Because they had all those resources. They have all those but they wanted to be integrated, but the United States, that was its muscle.
But here, John, the cautionary tale here is that
still exists in a way.
But the cautionary tale here today is that, those constraints are all being pulled off. The people in charge of policy today, the current administration, is not aware or not playing, but they don't understand.
They don't understand trade.
Right now, it is possible. I'm not saying that a trade deal can't be done with China or a trade deal can't be done with somebody else that might be that would solve some of the current problems. It's not as though the current situation's perfect and it shouldn't be changed at all. But there's a lack of strategic thinking. They don't understand.
Clinton had a somewhat what you'd call a trade war, seeking fairer relations with China, had to do with the reserves and underpricing of the exports and that, and not letting U.S. imports in. But it's not quite the way that the things are here. If you remember General Mattis?
Yes, yeah.
Well, they had that big thing, a smoke screen at the time he left and was fired. But he'd already incurred the wrath of Trump and was on his way out. But at that time they said, there was a big thing where the First Lady said, on her trip to Africa, somebody from one of the staffs, it was John Bolton's staff, was mean to her and all that. I'm saying, what absolute crap. It was during one of Matt Connerton's radio shows. So I went on and went to sites where, more, like news, like you can find it on The Economist or something.
Yeah.
At that exact time, Mattis had a press conference with a 4-star general from China and one of their top Politburo members and a trade official, and he was adamant that trade would contain any military threat that they pose, which is considerable. They do have a threat, but it's not that they want to be the threat. And at that same time, That's not being played up on the news. You know, the American news is advertising driven and all that.
But there's a dead cat somewhere in a tree.
Because you have to read the news. You have to learn how to read news. Right. We had to do it when we were at university. That's one of the things I was taught. Right. Like, read The Economist. Right. We couldn't get the Times or something like that. And you read it. It's not like the gospel or anything, but it's going to you. Piece together the truth.
I remember I was in a course at one point and doing European studies, and that was here in the United States. And he was at Merrimack College, and I was doing some. Anyway, I was doing work there for a purpose, and part of that thing was we had to do an extraordinary amount of reading every day. So we had the the pink page, the Financial Times of London.
Yeah.
The
There's
International.
So much information in the Times.
The International Herald.
And the way it's presented has meaning.
And then but there was no time. Usually, you think you'd have a few, a day or two to. But then, But then this was a small class of 6 people, and then whatever came up, man, you had to know everything from page 1 to page 100, whatever was and how it interplayed with the other stuff you'd read. And I was it was blowing my mind that. But it was training the mind to actually.
That's part of intelligence work too.
Yes.
I'm not saying a specific type, but when Clinton became president, they found out his favorite news source was The Economist. Which was a key onto how he's thinking, and of course that was going to influence him. And the Times of London, no matter who's the prime minister, when Tony Blair was that's who he leaked to.
Yeah,
that's who.
Well, I tell you,
for
any young people who might be listening or others, if The Economist is a right-leaning or at least market-driven sort of market forces sort of magazine. So, for those who are of that bent, then they should not be afraid of it at all. It's a pro-business, and but it's a wonderful
conservative in the old-fashioned sense.
And so, but it's a wonderful, well-written,
liberal socially.
Perhaps socially, yes, but certainly from a business point of view. But
pragmatic.
I've told people, who are studying at university level, if they, let alone high school, maybe a little more than high school would require. But there are 2 pages in The Economist every week. That matter more than any others. It's got wonderful, right now Time magazine does 1 major article, 2 sub-articles, and that's the whole magazine. In The Economist, there are multiple
It takes a week
pieces.
to read The Economist.
It does. It takes. I have to rush at the end of the week so I can get ready for the next one. But there are 2 pages in there. 1 page is it's a sort of world political headlines for the week.
Right.
And they're all short little articles for those of us with small brains of 2 or 3 or 4 sentences.
What's going to key you to what's... It's like reading a ticker tape or something.
Exactly. But they've distilled, or the more modern word that people like to use, curated. They've curated the news, distilled it down to here's the essence of what's happening on the various continents in the world. And then a couple of pages further on, one is the world news politically, and the other is world news business-wise.
And see, what the British view is always the whole world matters because of that empire. You never see from the U.S. where you have the equal emphasis on Asia or Africa.
Well, you do today. If you go to our universities today, and people who are studying business today in university, they are studying the economies of South America, the economies of the Far East, etc. Yeah, I mean, it's just look.
It's not the old days.
You go and read the annual reports of a company like, say, Boeing, right? A kind of quintessential American company, Americana, flags and eagles and all that stuff. The chairman of the board of Boeing, 10 years ago when Boeing pulled out or moved its headquarters out of
Seattle to
Chicago, and they talked about, it's in couched terms, but it's in there that they're a world organization. They're building planes in China and in other places, and in their annual statement, it contains a statement, paraphrasing it, that insofar as Boeing is seen as a United States company around the world, the more it's seen that way, the less successful it will be. So we as a company have to ensure that we're seen as a global company and not as a nationalist American company.
Right, because Airbus kind of... It was an international company, and then it leveraged certain old colonial relationships to get Malaysia would get the planes, or Qatar, or
so this idea that you could establish not just a plane company, but you could be making any widget you want. You could be making toothpaste. You could be like Gillette making razors.
You could make anything in China.
But if your worldview, and you could make it here too, I'm not fine with that. But if your worldview is I'm going to do what is I'm going to try and capture the U.S. market. I'm going to ignore the rest. Well, good luck with that. You've got 3% of the world population. What do you got? The other 97% have never heard of your razors. So, anybody coming out of college today, it is a global economy, whether we like it or not.
The explosion of the Chinese economy, where it will soon be the biggest economy in the world. It's almost unthinkable when you think about when Nixon went to China in 72.
Absolutely.
And how poor it was. Or think about what India was like, even under Indira Gandhi and her son.
And India's
before it really started developing.
And India's got a long way to go. And we talk about nationalism and jingoism and all that stuff. We have Mahendra Modi, who was re-elected last week. Another, he's a Hindu nationalist. And so there are some good underpinnings there, some initiatives there that are happening, but it's all led by this sort of nationalism thing, which is a little dangerous. But going back to Nixon, I love what you said about Nixon, because here's an example of a president who rightfully should be maligned, and he should be more maligned than he is, because he did a lot of terrible things and caused a lot of damage to America's world image, etc., and did real damage to the economies of South America, etc., and Vietnam, of course, and never forget Vietnam and the 58,000 people who died there.
But when it came to international politics, real politics,
his opening to China, which was not supported by everybody, his own cabinet didn't support his, but he,
the Republican Party.
Yes, but yet he went and he did it. And we wouldn't have the growth of our the great businesses we have today in the United States. It's not solely responsible for that one action, but that one action opened the world, and eventually it actually changed China,
changed the United States.
Yes, but it wasn't a one-way thing. It wasn't like a unilateral. We reached out. That action had the effect of transforming China.
Yeah.
So, but I think I worry that some of the adults have left the room in the Department of Trade, in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and the Department of State. That we have sort of mercantile, utilitarian, transactional politicians and managers managing these issues today, who are sort of, if I get one, then I must take it. It has to be a net loss for you and a net gain for me. And there is such a thing as a win-win, and those are the deals that we should be looking at, where everybody wins.
Do you think we only got 3 minutes? Do you think that Trump is foolish enough to engage Iran militarily?
I think he's foolish enough. Well, first of all, I worry about Bolton, because he's had a career of wanting to attack Iran. But I worry about the fact.
Yeah, but
President Trump, to me, has got the syndrome of a newborn baby who really only sees the world about 3 feet out from their head or whatever. Right? They've got a little. And for Trump, always the calculus is always going to be what's in it for me.
How to grab that brass ring.
If Trump was going down for whatever, and if there was a real problem tomorrow, what is it, Wag the Dog or whatever that movie was. I could see a Gulf of Tonkin type incident being manufactured.
Yeah, there almost was one.
And anytime you put that many forces and you send more and more forces into a small and confined and volatile space, it just takes a spark, and I don't see, it'll take an intemperate man like President Trump is not the most, sanguine, who's going to make decisions that are pragmatic.
And you have to remember that when Britain and France in 1956 and Israel fought over the Suez Canal, that's when Khrushchev took Hungary.
Yes, because they were busy looking elsewhere.
Yeah. And I put the Sixth Fleet to interdict the Anglo-French and Israeli
What would happen tomorrow in a transactional world?
Our burden.
In a transactional world, there was a meeting last week for the first time in decades,
we got to get going,
between Taiwan and the Taiwanese government and the U.S. government on the trade, at least on the trade side. So if China decided to take a hard roll there and rolled across the Gulf of Formosa, the small Formosa Straits, I mean.
Right, they have an overwhelming firepower.
What would the reaction of the? We can have all the paperwork deals in the world and treaties. What would the reaction of the administration be?
Somebody like Putin can cause a lot of trouble with a very little investment.
The advantage of having a president like Trump that nobody can predict is a real advantage. The volatility and the lack of being able to understand, that's a real advantage. But
not really.
But boy, is it a high-risk strategy that you don't know whether your guy is going to pull the trigger or not. That's pretty high risk.
That's a whole other show, because Nixon adopted that in the Bangladesh War and in the Yom Kippur War, and I always figured that was part of the reason when they realized
we should do
Nixon
these shows by theater or something, because we got a lot of geography to cover.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on.
Oh, John, it's a pleasure. I love to chat.
Yeah, we will see you next week, and until then, celebrate the Falcons.
All right, way to go.
Makes Manchester unique. Bye.
Thank you, John. Good night.